thank you to Supremacy 1914 for sponsoring this video. World War I erupted at the height of the colonial scramble. At the turn of the century, most land had been laid claim to by the imperialist powers, which caused the empires to begin challenging each other for their possessions, cascading into one of the largest wars in history. Supremacy 1914 models one of my favorite periods of military history, a period in which almost every aspect of society and warfare was revolutionized. Choose your favorite nation during World War I in a free online PvP strategy game with up to 500 players on one map in real-time games. The game has an expansive tech tree with 120 different units, an economy system and resource trade market, and many historical or fictional maps and scenarios to play out. Play Supremacy 1914 today for free on PC or mobile using the same account, and if you click the link in the description, the pinned comment, or scan the QR code, you get 15,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only valid for 30 days.
So you don't find any explanation for poverty in colonialism, the reverse perhaps. Well, does this suggest then that in addressing poverty in today's world there ought to be a latter-day reincarnation of imperialism or colonialism in some form?
The people who are in the imperialist nations don't want to take on that.
But some would say that there is the functional equivalent of that in the operation of the multinational corporation today.
This is from an interview with conservative American economist Thomas Sowell. In the interview, he reasons that colonization developed regions and made the colonized people rich. That colonized populations in the long term benefited from what he rightly recognizes as terrible acts done unto their ancestors by imperialists. He provides an example to demonstrate how colonized areas are rich, and uncolonized areas are not, by citing the Roman colonization of Britain, whereby Romans colonized England, which is rich, and eventually ended up having a massive overseas empire, and did not successfully colonize Scotland, which did not have an overseas empire. What Thomas Sowell fails to consider is that the conditions that facilitated England's later ascendancy were also conditions which made it more attractive for colonization than Scotland, just like how the Spanish colonial administration in what was to become Mexico was dependent on essentially taking over the existing organizational structure of the Aztec Empire. Material conditions create a framework for human activity. Before continuing, it's important to be equipped with a common vocabulary. So as new terms come up and become the focus of our discussion, we will be defining them. Starting, of course, first with colonialism. Quoting Lorenzo Veracini in Colonialism, A Global History, published by Routledge in 2022. Colonialism is premised on violence as well as displacement. It is displacement that produces two distinct locales, metropole and colony. But it is violence that enables colonial dispossession and appropriation. Violence is what makes colonialism an unequal relation. No violence, no colonialism. Colonialism happened in waves, with each wave carrying its own unique set of circumstances and characteristics. Each colony similarly could be its own unique colonial formation. Different colonialisms aim towards different relational outcomes. Quoting Veracini, sometimes colonial regimes aim to reproduce themselves to perpetuate the unequal relationship across time substantively unchanged. On the other hand, settler colonialism, a mode of colonial domination where resident colonies are established by populations emanating from the metropole or from a variety of metropoles, aims to extinguish itself as a relationship, to terminate indigenous political autonomy, if not the indigenous populations, until there is no relation. During the heyday of the colonial or imperialist era, at the beginning of the 20th century and before World War I, there were colonies of settlement and colonies of exploitation. They worked differently, but both were expressions of a world made by colonialism. Let's talk about colonial precedents and proto-colonialism.
It was a horrifying tragedy, but there's nothing particularly abnormal about them. The Muslims had their own empires with genocides, such as the Armenians or Jews, or the brutal invasion of India.
Africa is poor because of colonization. I'm like, please, let's move on from that. Does it have maybe a tiny percentage in where we are today? Maybe, and I don't know. But I know it's not the cause. Because if it were, many countless countries have been colonized before, and by the way, colonizing one another is humanity's history. It's the history of the world. We've been capturing each other back and forth, all of that.
In their ideology, colonialism is by default a crime. So when woke activists mention colonial crimes, they lose their mind. However, the golden rule is that it's only racist imperialism when a white country does it. Otherwise, it's chill. It's just part of a country's right to expand beyond its borders, and it's just part of history.
These examples are often brought up to confuse you, and not to explain what sort of developments eventually led to modern colonialism, and illustrate ways in which these two phenomena are similar and ways in which they are different. It's brought up to conflate them and to render the concept of colonialism as a sort of constant, a thing that's always been there and always will be. It portrays colonialism almost as a force of nature, a thing that just happens because it's just what we do. This is of course a very convenient narrative for those who hold colonialism in high regard. Quoting Vercini, "There were precedents before modern blue water colonialism, and there was globalization before the onset of colonial globalization. The quote pre-colonial commercial middlemen interacting with Europe were Swahili, Arab, Gujarati, Malabari, Malay, and Chinese merchants. The Crusader states were proto-colonial. The Italian maritime republics controlled semi-sovereign factories in the Levant. The expansions of the Vikings in the North Atlantic was in many ways colonial, and so was the Christian reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula that began in the 11th century. But with the so-called discovery and conquest of the Atlantic Islands, the Canary Islands before the other ones, the relationships involved in domination became recognizably colonial." What Vercini says here is important. Recognizably colonial. You understand innately that when these talking heads talk about conquests thousands of years ago, those are different from the colonies of just 100 or 200 years ago. Even if you might not understand why, you know they're different, but hopefully this video will explain why. This portrayal fronted by these talking heads completely strips all actors in the stories of colonialism of any sort of agency, whether they be perpetrators, victims, or somewhere in between, and completely strips you of any real understanding of colonialism. Modern colonialism, that is, colonialism in the so-called era of colonialism or era of imperialism, shaped many conceptions of race, class, culture, gender, and so on. Wherever Europeans went, they engaged in an unequal cultural exchange. Some of this cultural exchange no doubt was decided by both sides, but some was also pressed upon the lesser party by the more dominant one. Think of anti-sodomy laws, for example, introduced in various colonies by Europeans bringing with them their particular views on the intersection of morality and sexuality. European colonial domination was closely connected to the Industrial Revolution, both feeding into European ascendancy on the emerging world stage, and a concept such as a global world stage only came into being as a result of modern colonialism. So when history legends ask why the Spanish aren't asking for compensation or apologies from quote Muslims, it's because the Umayyad Caliphate no longer exists, as opposed to France, which as of 2024 still exists despite the best efforts of the French people, and still maintains a colonial relationship with many parts of the world. France, as recently as last month, sent troops to New Caledonia, one of its island territories in the Pacific, in order to quell protests over a voting rights law decided on in Paris. Modern colonialism has a direct through line of continuity to modern society. It's integral to the construction of our modern world. You cannot understand the way the world looks today without understanding colonialism. In that clip where Jordan Peterson is talking to Magata Wade, she claims Africa is not poor due to colonization. She says maybe it had an effect, she doesn't know, but she knows for sure it's not poor because of it. We divide the world by terms such as the developed world of the global north and the developing world of the global south. Africa is most definitely considered a part of the developing world and the global south. This itself is a distinction that arose from colonial relations. The global north was the colonizing imperial core, and the global south was the colonized periphery. We are still speaking of these regions in colonial terms, because the global north is still the metropole and the global south, the periphery. Vercini outlined 7 colonial waves that spread outwards from Europe. First wave colonialism found its success in places with already existing networks of trade, like that of the Aztec Empire, which the Spanish conquered, or the trade routes of the Indian Ocean. Much of this conquest came in the form of plunder, as the colonizers who had set out came from regions that were not very productive and so were encouraged to draw plunder from these colonized regions. Quoting Vercini, "A crucial cycle of global capital accumulation could then begin. Manufacturing activities in Europe were greatly stimulated, while profits could be reinvested in colonial enterprises. Capitalism and colonialism went hand in hand." I should at this moment define capitalism, using a definition from Leone and Potter from Historical Archaeologies of Capitalism. Capitalism is generally defined as an economic system based on a set of social relations characterized by private ownership of resources, including land, raw materials, and property. A major characteristic of capitalist societies is the continuous introduction of technical changes, which are pushed into places where they did not previously exist, and therefore alter the structures of labor and consumption. The capitalist system relies on the expansion of production to produce increased profits. Therefore, owners and agents are constantly looking for new markets and customers, both domestically and internationally, as well as expanded resources to bring into their production processes, including labor and raw materials. In a capitalist system, the differences between owners and workers, the colonizers and the colonized, and profits and wages represent real differences in ownership and power. You see this feedback loop powering much of the construction of the global economic system, where new techniques lead to the need for new resources leading to a need for more or different kinds of labor, which then results in increased production, which then results in a need for new markets to sell to. All of this leads to an integration of every part of the world into a series of global relationships we call the capitalist system. And the means by which this integration occurred was colonialism. Quoting Vergini, "The second wave saw the importation into the Americas of enslaved labor from across the Atlantic Ocean, and the organization there of proto-industrial production and commercialization of a few colonial commodities, mainly sugar. The labor-intensive cultivation of sugar gave rise to a new form of slavery, which was, quote, markedly distinct from previous forms of slavery, called chattel slavery." Continuing, "And they required great capital investment and enhanced technical capabilities. The sugar plantations and the sugar trade were thus a hothouse of capitalist development. The form of slavery was different, and the form of conquest was different in that it was in service of a new and different global capitalist system, which revolutionized production and social relations wherever it went. This is key to understanding how colonialism in this modern era was different to imperial conquests hundreds or thousands of years before this. These two things were not the same. Capitalism has not always existed, and neither has this colonial system." Quoting further, "Violence underpinned colonialism in all its operations. Slavery is violence, a type of social death, and millions were sacrificed to the altar of capitalist accumulation and the pursuit of the colonial trades. The already mentioned great divergence between Europe and the rest of the world is one result of extraordinary violence, not of better economic performance. China, the Islamic world, and India had been wealthier and more advanced than Europe was when the divergence began. But it was violence and a determination to violently enforce colonial monopolies that established domination. Only much later, unequal terms of trade could be exploited without ostensible violence. Yet again, as we will see, there is no profitable free trade without a previous monopolistic phase, and the latter should be seen as a precursor rather than the antithesis of the former. The great dyings due to violent suppression of anti-colonial resistance and the virgin soil epidemics like smallpox created a labor shortage which encouraged the import of slave labor, and the expansion of the chattel slavery system, and the importation of settlers to the colonies. The third wave came through settlers beginning to appropriate more and more indigenous land. An example is Manifest Destiny, going westward. Quote, "Settler colonialism as a mode of domination thus is unlike the other modes of colonial domination we have encountered so far. While first and second wave colonialism aimed to subjugate and exploit indigenous populations or to subjugate and exploit imported ones, the settler aims to remove or eliminate the indigenous peoples they encounter, or to relocate them away from their growing communities." The term indigenous and indigeneity often seems to be used without definition, and I also used it before in this video without delving deeper into it. Oxford Bibliographies is quite exhaustive in defining the various elements that make up the multitudes of definitions of indigeneity. Quote, "Indigenous people are often identified as the first people of a specific regional area. The Sami of Norway are indigenous people of Sápmi, but Norwegians have lived in Norway for a very long time. But what is Norway, and when did the population we can consider Norwegian come to be? What claims do the Sami and the Norwegians have over northern Norway, and where do their claims intersect? And who should have most claim? As a species, we all emerged from Africa and made our way outwards towards various parts of the world. Whoever got there first isn't easy to prove, and it doesn't seem very fair either. What do the people thousands of years ago have to do with us? All of this complicated nonsense seems to often get brought up in conversations about indigeneity. And the reason for that is that this definition of indigeneity is not the one utilized by people who actually talk about this topic. This vague definition is not very useful. It's unworkable in a general sense, even if it can be applicable in some specific situations, and it leads to all kinds of confusion. Not only that, it can lead to some uncomfortable blood and soil nationalism. Here's a more workable definition that's utilized academically. Indigenousness is an identity constructed, shaped, and lived in the politicized context of contemporary colonialism. The communities, clans, nations, and tribes we call indigenous peoples are just that, in contrast to and in contention with the colonial societies and states that have spread out from Europe and other centers of empire. In this definition, indigenous stands in opposition to settler and colonizer. Without colonialism, there is no indigeneity. Because of this, as absurdly as it may sound, the English are not indigenous to Britain, because they're not a colonized population. The vast groups of people who settled in what is now England before and who make up what we now call the English were not largely colonizers, they were migrants. The Norse assimilated with what came to be the English, or left, same with the Romans. There were people there who thrived before, but what made them indigenous was the arrival of the non-indigenous, and the non-indigenous are only so because of the existence of the indigenous. Colonialism, as I will continually stress, is participation in a system of relations. And, as I mentioned, migrations are not colonialism. Colonialism is accompanied by and facilitated by violence. Relations not predicated on violence or subjection, like the relationship between a host and a guest, are not colonial. Taiwan was colonized by the Dutch, and then the Imperial Chinese, then the Japanese, and then the Chinese nationalists of the current-day Republic of China, or Taiwan. But before then, there was an indigenous population who were colonized. There's an indigenous population of Ireland, because the United Kingdom still maintains a colonial territory in Northern Ireland. White people can be indigenous, and people of color can be colonizers. And colonization by non-European polities can still be racist imperialism. It just so happens that Europeans are mostly white, and Europe or Neo-Europes founded by settler colonialism elsewhere is where most of the colonial waves originated. But as mentioned, one colonial wave also washed out from Japan. Third wave colonialism is still ongoing today in the continued maintenance of the relations between settler population and the indigenous population. I'm referring to varying degrees of disenfranchisement, dispossession, and repression of the indigenous population's demands. Settler colonialism is of course also alive and well in occupied Palestine. Quoting Vercini, after 1948, after the Palestinian Nakba, and after the ethnic cleansing of most of the indigenous Palestinians, a settler society came into existence. After 1967, the settler project re-emerged in the Israeli-occupied West Bank and Gaza. Sometimes settler societies renegotiate the terms of domination with the indigenous population, which allows them to maintain the settler society in a more limited form that's more palatable to the colonized population. For example, in South Africa, apartheid was ended. However, quote, many of the settlers of South Africa, those who have not actually left, now practice semigration and move to the beach suburbs of Cape Town or to secluded and fortified enclaves. Sometimes a settler project fails, and the settler society is abolished. Quote, the Rhodesians and before them the Pied Noirs of French Algeria were long-standing communities by the time of their disestablishment. Now the settler colonies live primarily online. The point being, this form of colonialism is still very easily observable today, and its characteristic forms of domination are very visible in the United States, in South Africa, in Israel, in Northern Ireland, in Xinjiang, and many other places. The fourth wave, Vercini calls the imperialism of free trade, which occurred simultaneously with the third wave, but brought with it different transformations. Political economists had begun to argue that the maintenance of empire was an old mercantilist relic. They argued that England did not need to raise revenue from the newly independent American settlers. Quote, it needed to sell them goods and profit from investment opportunities. Independence had worked for all, they argued. They had not asked the indigenous peoples, or the enslaved of course. Indeed, independence and increased free trade had furthered their subjection. Quoting further, similarly, the political economists argued, why own slaves when one could contract other types of equally unfree labor? Despite the abolition of slavery, the global economy still needed chattel slavery, and slavery of other kinds was still maintained through contracts and apprenticeships, whereby the freed slave, now apprentice, was not free to work for anyone but the master they were apprenticed to. Cotton from plantations of the American South, worked by slaves, was needed for the industrial mills of England, which then enabled the British to flood India with cheap products, turning India into a net importer of British textiles. Fourth wave colonialism needed markets to sell to and an industrial proletariat to produce goods. It required that traditional societies be transformed to absorb the increased industrial production of the colonial metropole, or the imperial core. Economies which had produced for much of the needs of the local population were outcompeted by Europe and transformed. The local population had to sell their labor for cash, or grow crops that could be sold for cash. Of course, the Indian textiles would have been more labor-intensive and therefore more expensive to the consumer than the English textiles. So in a sense, this free trade colonialism made consumer goods more available to everyone. However, the profits were enjoyed in the colonial core, and the result of this transformation was the de-developing of the industry of India and other colonies. This reliance on the colonial core, who have the privilege of setting terms favorable to them, is a major contributor to the underdevelopment of the so-called Global South. Quote, now the natives of the world would be taxed, robbed, ripped off, their economies undeveloped, their bodies appropriated and stolen, and deported or removed from their country. and they would be civilized. This more informal form of colonialism through free trade ended and gave way to the fifth wave, an imperialist scramble and the reassertion of formal colonial structures. This period is characterized by a return to colonial competition after about a century of British domination. What signified your right to own a particular part of colonized land was the existence and function of a colonial state in that area. The construction and maintenance of these colonial states was done on the cheap, often with a governor residing in a capital, with native rulers controlling the periphery of the colony, but answering to the colonizers in the capital. Quoting Vercini, "There was another novelty. If the imperialism of free trade had marked the apex of colonial power, the successive phase witnessed stubbornly increasing anti-colonial challenges. One could argue that a tidal global surge of anti-colonial nationalism was already mounting. Accelerated expansion, normally a sign of a functioning sociopolitical system, was actually a response to its global crisis. Colonial domination was now challenged more than it had ever been. According to Vercini, these colonial states were run on the cheap, so repression became the default mode of operation. The transformation was still substantive even if it was limited by how cheaply these states had to be maintained. To pacify the local population, which was increasingly mounting resistance, infrastructure had to be built. Telegraph lines, roads, railways, and police stations. This sort of new level of investment into the colonies was expensive. The expense, coupled with the attitude that these colonies should be profitable, created an unsustainable contradiction. This is what people talk about when they say the colonies weren't profitable or that they constituted a financial loss. This is only true in certain periods, and only because of the mounting anti-colonial resistance and the need to maintain a colonial state to stake your claim. This observation that the colonies were not profitable also misses the forest for the trees. Again, as was mentioned under the fourth wave of colonization, the imperialism of free trade, as Vercini put it, the ever-expanding manufacturing in Europe needed markets for their manufactured goods. The imperialism of free trade was searching for profits, and it found it in great abundance. The profit was going towards private investors, towards the new movers and shakers of society, the capitalist class. Even the Belgian Congo, owned privately by King Leopold, was representative of this new transformation of society. King Leopold was an aristocrat, but Belgian Congo wasn't owned by the Belgian state. King Leopold had established a publicly traded corporation, of which he was CEO. Belgian Congo was owned by King Leopold because King Leopold owned the company that owned Belgian Congo. The horrors of the Belgian Congo were exacerbated by a rapacious need to extract as much rubber as possible and make as high profits as possible in the small window in which naturally occurring wild rubber was still in more abundance than rubber planted on plantations, which would take some years to start producing. What caused this all to become a scramble was not just the profits, but the speculative profits one could acquire, like rubber suddenly becoming insanely profitable as the industrialization of Europe demanded it for its machines. As well as the idea that once a colonial state with a bureaucracy and infrastructure had been established, that was fully and squarely yours, which meant you had to scramble to establish these colonies in places where you didn't need them necessarily, in case your enemies needed them. In the sixth wave, colonialism saw innovative new forms of colonial domination that explicitly claimed not to be colonial. This involved the creation of trusteeships, protectorates, mandates, and so on. The mandate, such as British Mandate Palestine, was a trusteeship set up for potential future self-governance. Japanese imperialism spoke of Asian co-prosperity and standing against European colonialism and imperialism. And, quoting Vercini, Zionists represented themselves as socialist and nationalist pioneers, possibly surrogate colonizers, certainly not colonizers in their own right, even though they relied on an imperial promise about a national home in Palestine. Internationalist anti-colonialism swelled as well. A Pan-African Congress was held in 1919, and in 1920 the Soviets espoused an internal policy of indigenization, with an aim to have its diverse populations embrace Soviet modernity on their own national terms. The Third Socialist International directed that local communists should ally themselves with anti-colonial nationalists and defeat imperialism first. National revolution and decolonization was thus seen as a necessary station towards a socialist revolution that was to be postponed. The world wars provided immense shocks to the global capitalist system, with the breakdown of trade and the breakdown of the flow of people that came as a result of the war at sea. Not to mention the ravaging of much of Europe. However, these shocks did not affect all equally. Quoting Adam Tooze from Wages of Destruction, though famine had been banished from Western Europe in the second half of the 19th century, in large part due to Europe's ability to tap huge new sources of overseas supply, World War I had forced the question of food supply back on the agenda of European politics. Britain did not face similar hunger shocks as Germany did during both world wars due to its ability to tap into this overseas supply of food. But what's not stated here is the effect that had on the colonized population, from whom the food was extracted. Quoting Cormac Gráda from Eating People is Wrong and other essays on famine, The infrequency of famines in India before the mid-18th century relative to the 19th century may be more apparent than real, since it rests on the dubious presumption that no documentary evidence means no famine. The first 4 decades of the new century was largely famine-free, and just a few years before the Great Bengal Famine of 1943 to 1944, a retired colonial civil servant might be forgiven for confidently declaring that, insofar as the Indian subcontinent was concerned, the old famine of history with its dreadful death toll is not likely to recur. The Bengal famine has been described as an entitlements famine, that is, a situation in which price speculation created the so-called artificial shortage of rice. Gráda argues convincingly that there's little indication of any hoarding of food by merchants and the like, but instead that the lack of political will to divert foodstuffs from the war effort was mainly responsible for the famine. There was a harvest shortfall, but it would have been perfectly manageable in peacetime by diverting food and ensuring adequate distribution of available food. Quote, "The famine was a product of the wartime priorities of the ruling colonial elite." And so a war that had started in Europe and been expanded into Asia by the colonial ambitions of the Japanese Empire had created a famine on the other side of the world from the colonial metropole of London. Then came decolonization. Decolonization itself, like trusteeships, protectorates, and so on, was a process by which colonial empires sought to manage the terms of subjection and to delay liberation as best they could. For example, the United States insisted on independence for Indonesia. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, the anti-colonial insurgents were communists, and so the United States opposed decolonization. The United States was preparing a new form of colonial subjection for the neo-colonial world. Quoting Vergini, "There had been no template for colonial world domination, no coherent system. Indeed, colonial administrators themselves viewed decolonization as an imperially led reform. Quote, the imperial powers conceded independence where there were no strategic resources, no strategic implications, no communists or socialist movements ready to take over, and no settlers. Under the consolidated US hegemony, the post-war world order was one of ostensibly inclusive relationships of domination. This means political and military alliances, market integration, and so on. The First World still engaged in unequal relations with the Third World, however. The collapse of the old colonial order after the Second World War created the space for superpower competition, which resulted in many of the wars and foreign interventions of the Cold War. Korea had been a colony of Japan, and Vietnam a French colony. Quote, colonial relationships have shaped in one way or another the history of pretty much everywhere. We live in a global colonial present. Colonialism shapes international relations and relations within nations. And colonially defined identities remain a foundational feature of post-colonies and post-metropoles alike. To cap us off, I will be quoting extensively from Vergini's conclusions. The tensions still pitting Korea and Japan are a legacy of an unresolved and painful colonial past. Taiwan is a polity that coalesced from a succession of distinct colonial waves: Dutch, Imperial, Chinese, Japanese, and then nationalist. Now it is recognizing its indigenous populations, like other settler societies are doing, as it faces the prospect of reincorporation within one of the polities that at one time controlled the island. The post-colonial condition is dysfunctional. Not many post-colonial societies did well economically or politically after independence. Modernization and development did not happen in the post-colonial economies. Informal empire and dependency became at one point the key explanations for chronic underdevelopment after independence. The many tax havens where the global rich stash their cash and avoid taxation are also colonial formations. Sometimes they're actual colonies, like many of the British overseas territories that have stalled on the road towards actual independence. When settlers, businessmen, and colonial officials hastily liquidated their assets in the economies that were to be decolonized, and moved capital not to metropolitan centers, but to the tax havens that were being instituted, this money was afterwards brought back to post-colonial developing countries as foreign investment, in ways that compromised the independence of the newly independent nations. Profits were thus accounted as accruing in the tax havens and not in the developing countries the money had originated from. The new nations could not rely on badly needed revenue. A lot of the narratives I see on History YouTube often hyper-focus on an individual element of the vast colonial story. For example, like how a colony may not have been a net positive for government revenue, as if that's the most reasonable metric to gauge a colony's usefulness in a world whose economies are dominated by private ownership. Some hyper-focus on how adherence to a European path of development by opening up to more free trade, taking more IMF loans contingent on privatizing your resources for exploitation by multinational companies, and so on, would lead to more and better development. Many bring up how colonialism can't have brought about an underdevelopment in certain areas of the world because many former colonies, like the United States or Singapore, are relatively rich. while ignoring entirely the real material differences between all these colonies that they're comparing. Many try to decouple colonialism from its historic context, portraying it as this mystifying historic phenomenon that we can't really begin to explain. Or if we can only do so in the most simple terms possible, whereby it's just what we do. It's not just the echoes of colonialism that are all around us. The system changed a lot, but the general relationships have remained the same. Colonialism is still here, and anti-colonial struggles are being fought all over the world right now. Vercini put it well when he said, quote, "We live in a global colonial present." Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to Supremacy 1914 for sponsoring this video. Click the link in the description, the pinned comment, or scan the QR code to play Supremacy 1914 today for free, and get 15,000 gold and 1 month premium subscription for free. This offer is only valid for 30 days. Thank you so much for watching, and I'd like to thank the patrons whose support means so much to me. This video was originally going to be a bit different. I started out by trying to define colonialism so I could talk a little bit more about the narratives fronted around it. But then explaining and defining colonialism itself ballooned into a 20-page script. So I decided to leave it at that. Special thanks to Rowan M, LeBeau, Vishire, Jordan M, Nippon R, and Monday's Last Brain Cell for supporting at the $10 tier. If you'd like to support what I do, you can find my Patreon at patreon.com/Freda.